I love XCOM. While I didn't play the original classics, the newer installments are some of my most cherished games. I've easily sunk hundreds of hours into them, but as much as I enjoy those familiar experiences, I also like trying new things. That's why I've been interested in playing other XCOM-like games, to see what else the genre has to offer. Who knows, maybe these familiar mechanics will get a fresh twist. Or maybe, just maybe, someone managed to entirely improve on the formula. So you can expect more reviews of games in this genre from me sometimes in the future. But for now, let's take a look at Gears Tactics. Why Gears Tactics? Honestly, no big reason. I'm not even a Gears of War fan and haven't actually played any of the other games in the series. But as I was browsing through various games in the genre, Gears Tactics kind of leaped out at me. Maybe it was visually good looking graphics and the slick animations, or the characters with their bulky armor and giant chainsaw guns, or this. In any case, it looked like a game that would be fun to play and might even make for an interesting video. So here we are. At its core, Gears Tactics is a familiar squad-based tactical strategy game, or as many would call it, an XCOM-like. You control a squad of up to 4 characters, move them around the map, use cover, and fight enemies with a combination of skills and equipment, all while essentially rolling a die for each action. Now, I don't think we need to spend too much time on the basics, because if you've played any similar game before, you already know how these fundamentals work. What's more interesting are the ways Gears Tactics shakes things up. And surprisingly, there's quite a lot to cover here. For starters, this game leans heavily into its story-based approach. The campaign is full of cutscenes and dialogue-heavy story missions, which isn't common in this genre, and gives it a bit of a cinematic flair. Base and squad management also differ significantly from other games in this space. But before we dive into that, let's start with the most critical part – the combat mechanics. Starting with the biggest difference. Instead of having a set move and action like in D&D, your characters get action points, or AP, which you can spend however you want. Want to move through half of the map? Go for it. Shoot 3 times in a row? Totally doable. Throw a grenade, move, and then use an ability? Absolutely. You can mix and match actions however you like. This system fundamentally changes the gameplay, as action points become a resource you'll need to carefully manage. Each character starts with 3 actions per turn, but there's the catch. There are tons of ways to interact with them. Some characters can earn extra AP by performing certain actions. Supports can grant AP to others, and there are even abilities that provide refunds. The depth here is impressive, and it's the main mechanic that drives the game's strategy. In the later stages, when you really maximize this system, you can sometimes squeeze out up to 10 actions from a single character.
Drop that last drop. Down
This system works in tandem with the execution mechanic. Sometimes, instead of killing enemies outright, you'll down them, giving you the option to move in for a glorious bloody execution, which gives all allies an extra action point. This, combined with the other AP generation mechanics, can often turn combat into a bit of a puzzle, where you'll need to figure out the optimal sequence of actions to maximize AP and keep the momentum on your side. When done right, it can feel incredibly satisfying and almost too powerful, as you might not even give enemies a chance to act. Beyond the action points, there are a few other neat tweaks that give Gears Tactics its own flavor. One that I liked is the actual lines of sight. If something or someone is in the way, the shot might hit that instead of the target.
Almost out.
And yes, that includes allies. Also, if you kill an enemy mid-burst, the remaining bullets can hit another target behind them. It's a small and obvious detail, but other games don't really do it, even though it adds a layer of realism and tactical depth. Another interesting aspect is how Overwatch works. Not that one is unwelcome here. Overwatch shares the same name and general concept as XCOM, but the execution is very different. First, you have to select a specific section of space for your character to watch. This adds a layer of strategy, forcing you to predict enemy movements and carefully place your Overwatch zones. Lines of sight also come into play. If an enemy moves through the Overwatch zone while mostly in cover, your shots will likely hit that cover. Plus, time doesn't freeze when Overwatch triggers, which adds another layer of tactical consideration. But don't let all that fool you into thinking Overwatch is weak. It's actually incredibly strong in Gears Tactics, thanks to two things: interrupts and multi-shot triggers. When an enemy triggers your Overwatch, there's a chance it will interrupt whatever action they were about to do, leaving them wide open. And if you had multiple action points when you set up Overwatch, you'll shoot that many times. You can practically turn the battlefield into a minefield of bullets, shredding enemies the moment they step into your kill zone.
They're making a move.
It's beautiful. Lastly, Gears Tactics throws a surprising twist into the mix: boss fights. Yes, actual boss encounters in a tactical strategy game. There aren't many, just 3, but the first one catches you by surprise and is super engaging with great music to boot. While the later boss fights didn't capture the same magic for me, they're still a welcome change of pace and a fun addition to the game's combat. Moving away from combat, we enter the convoy, which serves as the base of operations in Gears Tactics. This is where all your characters hang out, where you recruit new ones, level them up, and handle other squad-related tasks. Now here's the bummer. There's no base building or upgrading. You can't research new tech, expand your convoy, or really interact with it in any meaningful way. It's just a static hub, which feels like a missed opportunity. Personally, I love the base management in XCOM. It gives you that extra sense of progression and investment. But here, it's more like, here's your base, it exists, move on. Unlike many games in this genre, characters don't need to rest on the base after losing health or morale during missions. Most of the time, after using a character in a mission, they are immediately available for the next one, with no downtime. The only exception is when the game throws in some mandatory side missions between main story missions. These side missions mix things up by forcing you to use up to 10 different characters during this phase. Character equipment is handled through a weird RPG-style loot system with loot boxes. Honestly, it's a strange choice that feels pretty out of place in a tactical strategy game. I still don't fully understand why some developers insist on putting loot boxes in offline games. It's baffling. But at least here, you can't buy them with real money. That would have been a disaster. So, thematically, it's a bit jarring. But if we ignore that for a second, the system is okay? The game incentivizes you to take on additional challenges, like don't use grenades or no support characters allowed, which is a fun twist. And the loot boxes are a decent incentive to take on these challenges. They also encourage you to explore each level, sometimes going out of your way just to find them. As for the loot itself, it's fine but not particularly exciting or game-changing. You don't get new weapons, only mods for existing ones, which feels a bit cheap. There is some variety in armor, but it still felt a bit flat. It's functional, sure, but it doesn't give you that satisfying gear progression that games like XCOM absolutely nail. I never had that "wow, this changes everything" moment. It's more like "oh, cool, I guess I can shoot one more time now." An additional issue is that managing all this loot can get confusing and tedious. With so many characters to gear up and so much loot coming in, it's easy to lose track of who's got what. I found myself constantly wading through equipment menus, trying to remember which character needed which piece of armor. By the time you're deep into the game, you're swimming in loot, and the management side of it becomes more of a chore than anything else. Overall, the equipment system is a fair addition, but it's not a game changer. It can come in handy, an extra action point here, a free shot there, but it's not something I went out of my way to optimize. In other words, it adds some flavor, but doesn't define the game. This is a nice transition into a discussion about the difficulty of the game. Maybe my lukewarm feelings towards the equipment system stem from the fact that the game didn't challenge me much. I played on the third out of 4 difficulties, which is described as experienced for seasoned turn-based tactics players who want a serious challenge. Sounded perfect for me. I wasn't looking for an unforgiving experience, just something tough. But I can't say it lived up to the description. It wasn't a cakewalk, but I also didn't struggle much. I didn't feel the need to carefully plan my team's composition, worry about skills, or meticulously gear up each character. I just went with whatever sounded cool, and it always worked out just fine. And by fine, I mean I finished the whole game with 0 casualties. That pretty much tells you everything about how tough it was. I'll explain that later. And I didn't resort to save scamming either. Actually, you can't really do that in this game. You can't save and reload mid-mission. Your only option is to restart the whole thing if you mess up. There are checkpoints, but for some reason the reload from checkpoint button sometimes still reloads the whole mission anyway. I think this system is meant to stop players from save scamming, which is something people often do in these games. But come on, it's a single player game. If someone wants to reload after every missed shot, you let them. There's no reason to police how people have fun. If you want a more hardcore experience, there's always Iron Man mode. All in all, playing on what was supposed to be a hard difficulty felt more like playing on normal, challenging but not very demanding. Except for a few missions that crank the difficulty way up for no apparent reason. They've become a bit infamous in the community for being significantly harder than the rest of the game, with no real explanation. For example, there are a couple of missions where you're given just 2 characters instead of the usual 4, but the enemies and mission objectives remain the same. This makes you incredibly underpowered, while the enemy is as strong as ever. Challenging? Yes. Fair? Not so much. Another mission has you running from bombardment while collecting supplies, but this time with only 2 action points per turn instead of 3. Trying to pick up supplies, avoid bombardment and fight enemies with just 2 AP is extremely tough. The difficulty spike is unreal, easily the hardest mission in the game, but I still managed to complete it on my first try with no casualties. This brings me to Jack, because I suspect that he is a culprit of the game being easier than anticipated. You've likely noticed that despite the 4 character squad I've been talking about, I always actually have 5 units in the field. That's because on every mission I've had the Jack of all trades robot, or just Jack. He's a companion robot that is present in almost every game in Gears franchise.
Jack, plug in and see what you can find.
And was added to Gears Tactics in a big update, along with new loot, enemies and other features. Jack is an interesting, albeit weird addition. At the start of the game, you can decide whether to include him in your playthrough. If you do, he's there on every mission without taking up a squad slot. He's a pure support character, can't shoot, execute enemies or take cover, but he can cloak every turn and comes with a ridiculously powerful set of support abilities. His toolkit includes things like spawning guns for your team, reloading everyone's weapons, taking control of enemy units, stunning entire groups of enemies for 3 consecutive turns, and even granting the entire squad an extra action point. No one else in the game can do anything close to this. Naturally, having Jack on your team makes the game easier. Way easier. The odd part about Jack is that it doesn't feel like he was a part of the original game design. It almost feels like he was shoehorned in as an afterthought with the post-release update. If they had written him into the story, it would have been pretty cool, but as it stands, he's just sort of there, making your life easier without much explanation. That said, I played the whole game with Jack, and I can't say I regret it. The squadmates have cool reactions to him.
See ya, Jack.
And he's a blast to use, even if he's way too strong for a free addition. Yeah, the game is noticeably easier with him around, but it's also more fun, so I'm not complaining. At least Jack was a stable presence in the squad, someone I could actually get attached to, because that's definitely not the case for most of the other characters. I really didn't feel connected to the majority of the characters. In XCOM, I would customize every single soldier, name them, create backstories, play favorites, and be genuinely heartbroken if something bad happened to them. Here, none of that. Part of the reason is the limited customization options and the flawed loadout system. But more than anything, it's because there's just no reason to get attached. The game constantly throws new recruits at you, and they're often higher level than your existing squad. Why would I bother naming or customizing my level 3 heavy, when in a few hours I'll be getting a new level 5 heavy? Another factor is the skill tree system, which for the first half of the game doesn't offer much distinction between classes. Sure, you've got your supports who can chainsaw enemies, scouts who go invisible, and heavies with machine guns. But in the grand scheme of things, the distinctions aren't that dramatic. The skill trees do get more interesting later in the game, but then you run into another problem: unbalanced skills. Some skills are just objectively better than others. For instance, you can choose between a 25% chance of gaining action point on a critical kill or a nearly guaranteed 2 action points. Or how about the final skill of the tree that rewards you for destroying e-holes? Cool, except there are maybe 10 e-holes in the entire 30-hour game, most of which are present before you ever can get the skill. Stuff like that makes branching out and experimenting with your characters feel a bit meaningless, since some will just end up considerably weaker than others. And where's the fun in that? Because of these issues and the lack of attachment, I found myself indifferent to most of the characters, except for the main story crew. They're with you for most of the game, can die, and are central to the story, showing up in cutscenes and experiencing actual character development.
Okay, let's do this.
I just ended up using them whenever possible and reserved the most interesting builds for them. And honestly, that ended up being way more fun than I expected.
Call it a mercy kill.
Take Sid for example. I stacked every damage reduction and self-healing ability I could find, turning him into an absolute tank. He literally had over 100% damage reduction for the first hit each turn, meaning he took no damage.
Gotta keep away from those legs.
And even when he did take a hit, he just healed himself. Totally nuts. Then there's Gabe Diaz, the protagonist. He became a chainsaw massacre expert. with an instant kill ability on a 2-turn cooldown that refunded an action point and healed the team after every kill, he was a one-man wrecking crew. Also, thanks to this, he constantly got extra action points, since he didn't technically fire a weapon. By mid-game, the developers must have realized this was a bit too strong, so they introduced enemies with attacks of opportunity and poison clouds that debuff anyone nearby after death. These mechanics make charging in with a chainsaw riskier, but it didn't stop me, just required a little more strategy. And then there's Michaela Dorn, the sniper.
Find your own ride, assholes.
I love snipers in games like this. There's something incredibly satisfying about having high accuracy and picking enemies off from afar. But Michaela takes things to the next level. Not only is she the most accurate and deadliest character on the team, but she's also the best at stacking action points. With 3 separate abilities to gain or refund AP, plus the ability to reload for free, Michaela could easily rack up 10 actions in a single turn. At that point, the battlefield was less of a fight and more of a shooting gallery. With enemy heads being the watermelons, Michaela easily just pops. Near the end of the game, you get another main character, Reina, a scout. I'd mostly ignored scouts, because their shotguns felt weak compared to other weapons, like sniper rifles. But then I realized it wasn't about the weapons, it was about explosives. Reina became a grenade throwing specialist, with abilities that let her lob huge damage grenades every turn, and place proximity mines. Forget shotguns, when you can one-shot most enemies with a grenade, there's no need for anything else.
Drag out.
2 more.
At the start, I've mentioned that Gears Tactics is more story-driven than most games in this genre, and that's definitely true. It might be a tactics game, but it's also a Gears game through and through, with all the chainsaw revving, locust crushing grit fans love. And beneath the top-down gameplay lies an intriguing story. One that expands the Gears universe and gives us a new perspective on the brutal fight for survival against the Locust Horde. The game is packed with dialogue and cutscenes, and instead of the campaign being mostly randomly generated, here it features a bunch of fully pre-designed story missions. These missions are set in distinct, carefully crafted locations, bringing more depth and life to the story. This approach does wonders for world building and storytelling, but it does hurt replayability a bit, since those missions will play out almost exactly the same in future playthroughs. What really surprised me was that the story didn't feel like some random throwaway filler you might expect from a spin-off. I know I expected just that, a story with no real significance outside of its own game. But Gears Tactics feels like a lot more than that.
We're in for a fun ride, you and me.
Now, as I mentioned before, I haven't played any of the other Gears games, but after doing some research and falling down a bit of a wiki rabbit hole, I'm pretty sure this story is important in the grand scheme of things. Most of the characters in the plot are either connected to major events in the lore or directly related to other key characters in the main series.
Reina.
It's not vital for understanding the entire Gears universe, but it does enhance and expand the lore in a meaningful way. Gears Tactics is a prequel, set during the very early days of humanity's war with the Locust, roughly 12 years before the main series kicks off. The world of Serra is in chaos, with the Locust horde emerging from underground and wreaking havoc across the planet. The Coalition of Ordered Governments, or COG, is struggling to respond, and humanity's future is hanging by a thread. The story follows Gabriel Diaz, a former lieutenant colonel who became disillusioned with the COG's brutal methods during the previous war and requested a demotion, landing him in the engineering corps.
Lieutenant Colonel Diaz, it's been too long.
It's Sergeant now, Chairman.
After the devastating Hammer of Dawn strikes, Gabe is dragged back to the front lines, as Chairman Prescott personally orders him to hunt down and kill a Locust scientist named Ukon. Ukon is no ordinary Locust. He's a terrifying figure who created some of the deadliest monsters in the Locust arsenal. Things like Corpser and Brumak.
A monster who makes monsters.
Diaz is given no resources, no squad and no equipment, just a gruff partner, Major Sid Redburn.
Hold up, if this grub's as dangerous as you say, I need equipment, soldiers, an army.
Oh, you always were resourceful. Recruit whatever gears you find and figure out the rest.
Gabe is forced back into combat, a duty he's reluctant to resume, but can't avoid. His character arc is compelling, revealing a soldier torn between duty and his own ethical doubts.
No. I told Prescott, I don't do that shit anymore.
Together, Gabe and Sid scrape a squad of stranded COG soldiers. Along the way, they also save a convoy of civilians led by Michaela Dorn. Initially, the civilians resent the Gears, viewing them as nothing more than
Fascists.
but after some time and some grudging teamwork, they join forces and even begin training civilians to fight back against the Locust. With the team assembled, the squad finally goes after Ukon, managing to locate and attack him, only to find out that he can regenerate, making him practically unkillable.
Useless human filth.
This covers the first few hours of the game, which are very story heavy. Nearly every mission in this section is important. Characters are introduced, events unfold, and the plot keeps moving forward at a brisk pace. But then it slows down, like really slows down. For a solid stretch in the mid-game, you'll find yourself in a loop of side missions that don't do much for the story. You'll be stealing supplies, blowing up random objectives, or rescuing operatives over and over again. Occasionally, you'll hit a proper story mission that progresses the plot, but for the most part, you're just going through the motions. Once you finish the story, you unlock Veteran Mode. This is essentially an endless mode where you can keep playing for the sake of the gameplay itself. There's no more story, no cutscenes, no character progression, just missions and loot. It even adds a new loot tier above Legendary, and the goal of the mode is to find all 20 of these supreme items. It's a nice addition for players who really enjoy the combat and want to stick around. But for me, it just didn't have the same appeal. Without the story and stakes, it felt a little hollow. By the end, Gears Tactics left me with mixed feelings. I enjoyed the story and the character interactions. There are interesting twists, solid character development, and strong world building. You get to learn more about the origins of the Locust Horde, the shady dealings of the COG, and how everything ties together. For someone who's new to the Gears lore, it was really fascinating to discover. That said, I can't ignore the pacing issues. It feels like the game starts strong, but then grinds to a halt for a good chunk of the middle. And this isn't a particularly long game. It clocks in at around 25 hours for most playthroughs. Half of that time is spent on repetitive, samey missions. Without base building or research to break things up, the only progression comes from the story. And when the story slows down, the whole game feels slow. Before I wrap things up, I want to have a little rant about the state of the Gears of War franchise on PC. Numerous times I mentioned that I've never played any of the other Gears of War games. Think it's because I wasn't interested? Guess again. It's because unless you have an Xbox, playing them is such a pain in the ass. The original Gears of War from 2006 did make it to computers at that time, but it's pretty much fossilized at this point. No updates for newer hardware, so playing it today is an experience. I'm not even sure if you can buy it anywhere legitimately anymore. But there is no need, as there is a great 2015 remake, right? Right? Nope, that version is a broken disaster. I genuinely don't understand why they even bothered porting it to PC when it's that bad. First off, you can't get it on any of the usual digital stores. It's only available on Xbox.com. Even if you manage to get the game, actually launching it is a whole other nightmare. Wrong version of Windows, incorrect drivers, doesn't recognize your hardware. Too bad, it won't launch. And if by some miracle you do get it running, be prepared for a horror show. Low FPS, crashes, bugs, you name it. Or so I've heard. I couldn't get it to launch after all. But okay, let's forget about the first installment. Maybe we could just move on to Gears of War 2, 3 or Judgment. Except, well, none of them exist on PC. At all. Not even in a buggy, unplayable mess. They just never got released. I guess you could try to emulate or stream them, but that's a whole different can of worms. Then we have Gears of War 4, which did make it to Windows. Progress. Except it's pretty much the same hot mess as the Gears 1 remake. It's slightly more playable, but only if you can actually get it to run. Finally, there's Gears of War 5, or I guess it's just Gears 5 now. This one actually works. It's fully playable on PC with minimal issues, and it's even available on Steam. That's great, but what's the expectation here? That we'll just skip over the entire series and start with Gears 5? Or that long-time Xbox players will suddenly switch to PC? I honestly don't even know anymore. So, out of the 7 games in the franchise, here's what we've got. 1 fossil with a terrible remake, 3 games that never made it, 1 that is barely playable, 1 that finally works, and Gears Tactics, which actually ran perfectly. There's also Gears of War E-Day coming out soon, and it'll be on Steam. It looks promising, but without the ability to play the earlier games properly, my excitement is kind of muted. The way Gears of War has been handled on PC just feels disrespectful to both the fans and the series. It's sad to see an iconic franchise treated this way. It deserves better. There are rumors of a collection that will bundle all the games and make them playable on Windows. And I really hope that's true. But until that's officially announced, there's not much more to say. Overall, Gears Tactics is a solid game, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy my time with it. It introduces some really cool ideas, like the action point system, the unique take on Overwatch, and the lines of sight mechanics. The setting is great too. The Gears of War franchise has always had a cool vibe. And let's be honest, chainsawing enemies in half never gets old. Plus, the story was more intriguing than I expected. But what I really craved was more variety in pretty much everything. There are only a few enemy types, and many of them are just stronger versions of previous ones. The mission types also start to feel repetitive after a while. Most of all though, I wanted more variety and connection within my squad. Due to the issues with the skill trees and how new recruits tend to be better than your existing soldiers, I found myself sticking to the same 3 main characters most of the time. That's a bummer, because a big part of the appeal in this genre is building a squad, customizing them, giving them backstories, and seeing them evolve. Here I just didn't get that same connection. There's also no wild variety. No mechs, no psychics, no swordsmen. That's the kind of diversity I was missing. At the end of the day, the biggest issue with Gears Tactics is that XCOM 2 exists. Gears Tactics isn't a bad game by any means, but it clearly takes a lot of inspiration from XCOM, without quite reaching the same level of greatness. Still, some people will have a blast with it. If, like me, you've already played XCOM 2 to death and want to explore more games in the genre, Gears Tactics is a great choice. Or if you're a Gears fan looking for something a little different, I'd recommend giving it a shot. Ultimately, it will give you a few dozen hours of tactical, squad-based fun. That's it for Gears Tactics. Thank you so much for watching. But as I mentioned at the start of the video, this isn't it for XCOM likes. I'm planning to make this a bit of a series on the channel. Maybe even wrapping it up with a tier list or something fun like that. So don't forget to subscribe if you're interested in that. So far, I've got 13 games on my XCOM like list. Will I play all of them and make videos about every single one? Probably not. But I've already started playing a few, and I'll definitely be covering some of them here. If you have any suggestions for more games to add to the list, please drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear your recommendations. Now, the next review won't be about an XCOM like, but the one after that, most likely yes. And let's just say it'll also feature men in big, bulky armor, just the kind I like. But this time they're even bigger and bulkier.